Well, good morning. It's time for another video lesson. And again, I'm at home as you're probably at home. And so you'll be hearing noise in the background, various things going on. I am doing this on Saturday morning. Remember, no matter how long or short this particular video is, the whole point behind a video is you have pause and you have rewind. And so there's lots of things you can do. It's just simpler for me to more or less do this during one particular setting. At least we'll try it that way. There are some issues in different ways of doing things. Okay, so the last unit, Unit 7, is called the American Age, and basically after World War II, World War II entered. As after World War I, many of the nations in the world were in pretty bad shape, but the United States was not. Remember, other than the attack on Pearl Harbor, we actually had no physical attack by any countries against our nation. The battles were waged in other parts of the world. So we came out pretty good. The industrial capacity that we'd use to help us prepare and get through World War II also had got us out of the Great Depression. So we came out with our country intact. We came out with an industrialized society that was fired up and ready to go. And so that made things a bit more interesting compared to the rest of the world. So basically, we were in good shape and we were ready to, essentially we were the #1 world power after World War II. And in fact, Henry Luce, who published Time and Life magazines, said that basically the 20th century had become the American century. I know now a lot of times you may hear people talk about the 21st century being the American century, but historically, that's kind of what happened after World War II. And of course, after the war, alliances changed, and so now we were entering a period of Cold War between the communist nations and the free nations, which brings us to chapter 27, which is entitled The Cold War and the Fair Deal, which is from 1945 to 1952. We'll go back and look at the same time frame a little earlier. So basically, as soon as the war ended, a hot war ended, we were off into a Cold War. We had the alliance with the Soviet Union during World War II. It worked out to both of our benefits, but it had always been a little awkward anyway. And so during the spring and summer 1942, it basically fell apart. Nazism, which was our common enemy, had become eliminated. And so now we were basically global rivals and had too many differences ideologically, capitalism versus communism, freedom versus totalitarian control, religious freedom versus no religious freedom. So basically, the defeat of Japan and Europe, Germany and Japan had basically created power vacuums. Power vacuum in Europe with Germany gone, power vacuum in Asia with Japan gone. And so basically, the Soviet Union and the United States were basically into a period of time when we weren't maybe actually shooting each other, but certainly there was a lot of conflict going on ideologically and as we manipulated situations in other countries, which is basically why it's called the Cold War. We also saw after World War II a bunch of anti-colonial liberation movements in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East that basically would eventually take away the colonial empires of Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, and even the United States to some degree. You say how the United States? Well, for example, the Philippines gained their independence in 1946. And then making this even more complicated was the emergence of the Communist China, the People's Republic of China in 1949, that basically created problems even further. All right, if you're following along in your book, they're on page 1002. We've made it to 1,000. And so we're on page 1002. I just need to get my slide to get there, get past this guy that we never listened to. All right, so Truman and the Cold War, page 1002. Again, if you don't have your book, you don't have your outline, don't have your notes, you can pause and go get that. Again, this is under your control. You can shut me up anytime you want to. So in April 1945, which was only a few months after Truman had begun his presidency, his vice presidency, is when Truman was told that President Roosevelt was dead. Truman was a new figure in the Washington, D.C. area. On his first full day as president, Truman said, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now." I don't know. He didn't know what to do. So, and here's a test question coming up for you, okay? So he was from Missouri. And like his hero was Andrew Jackson. He was very blunt, very decisive, folksy. Language was a little bit different than normal White House. And even though he didn't have executive experience, he really had only served in local politics in Missouri. He was very confident and self-assured, basically, and ended up being a better president than many expected. Obviously, as in many presidents, there's lots of controversy about whether he was a good president or a bad president, but he was able to do some extraordinary things. So where does the Cold War begin? Well, one of the big questions that historians have messed around with is who was more responsible for the onset of the Cold War? Was it us or was it the Soviet Union? The conventional view, of course, is that it was the Soviets under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, who was a brutal communist dictator, killed a lot more of his people than Hitler did of his people, had a determination to dominate the globe after 1945. Modern, what we call revisionist historians, basically say, well, Roosevelt, Roosevelt had tried to collaborate with the Soviet Union, but Truman basically was confrontational of everything they did. That, of course, fails to recognize the fact that even before Truman became president, situation was not going well with the Soviets before the war was even over. Basically, some people would argue it was just inevitable. It had to happen. We were committed to capitalism, political self-determination, and religious freedom. Soviet Union was committed to controlling its neighbors, primarily to build a buffer for their country, and forcing everyone in their country to conform ideologically and prohibiting religious practices. They considered that a problem. So basically, a lot of, so part of it was communist ideology, part of it was probably just insecurity that created a lot of problems. Russia, of course, remember, had been invaded by Germany twice in the early 20th century, costing the death of 23 million people. So they were determined to create loyal nations in their borders. It's easy for us to sit here with two big oceans, a big ocean to the west, a big ocean to the east, and feel safe and secure. Soviets were a landlocked nation. Russia was a landlocked nation. And so basically they wanted to build buffers, land buffers around them, and the people of Eastern Europe were their target. Look at other conflicts of the Soviets. Basically, again, if you remember, part of the Yalta Conference was the agreement to allow for political freedom in Central Europe. Of course, after 1945, Stalin did not do that. He imposed military control and imposed a communist system on the nations of Eastern Europe that had been freed. Winston Churchill was a guy who coined the term Iron Curtain. He has said in a speech, which actually was given in the United States, he said that Iron Curtain has fallen, and that's where the term Iron Curtain came from. So for the next couple of years, the Soviets would take over basically about half of Europe. And they eliminated all political parties except the Communist Party. They created secret police forces, and they basically took over the media and controlled the life. They basically started battling against the Roman Catholic Church and organized a process of ethnic cleansing, okay? 12 million Germans, as well as Poles and Hungarians, were relocated from Eastern Europe, usually to West Germany, or in some cases to prison, some cases to Siberia, to the Gulag. At that time, the Secretary of State in the U.S. was James Burns. He tried to get the Soviets to agree to the Yalta Accords, especially in order to control atomic weapons, but that didn't happen. They paid little attention, partially because they had a lot of spies and they were developing their own atomic bombs. They were not interested. All right, that brings us on your slide to the containment policy. That's on page 1004 in your book. Okay. So basically, one of the experts at the time was George Kennan and the Soviet Union. And basically, he felt like the best way for us to deal with the Soviets was just be patient and persistent and try to contain Soviet expansionism. Basically, no war. Let's try to stay out of war. We just fought a big war. We're not interested in fighting another big war. Our biggest asset was our capitalistic democracies and their power. And so basically, that's how we would serve as a counterforce to communist expansion. And eventually, Kennan believed either the Soviet power would break up or at least would back down a little bit. Communism, in his view, was an inherently unstable system that would eventually collapse, which turned out to be prophetically true. No other American diplomat at the time actually really had envisioned what would happen 40 years later. So, all right, so in more detail, so in 1946, civil war broke out in Greece between the monarchy, which was backed by the British, and the Soviet-led communist insurgency. February 21st, 1947, the British informed the Greeks that it was too much for them and they were going to withdraw in a month. And Truman, of course, talked to congressional leaders about what to do. That brings us to the Truman Doctrine. Bottom page 1005, there is an essay question on the chapter 27-28 test. That's a ways off. We haven't even taken the 25-26 test. I decided to put the chapter 25-26 test off a little bit to allow you guys to get some basic work done on the beginnings of your research papers, since your thesis statements are due pretty quickly. And we'll hold off on the chapter 25-26 test till after Easter. I haven't come up with an exact date and time yet. I'm trying to figure out how to schedule that with all the conferences that we have. So anyway, on the chapter 27-28 test, there will be an essay question on the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. And you'll see as we go along, there's a relationship between the two. That's your next two topics on your the slide there, the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. There will be an essay choice on the chapter 27-28 test. So you can look forward to that. So let's look at the Truman Doctrine. So on March 12th, 1947, President Truman gave a radio speech, and television was not quite the thing yet in 1947. And he asked Congress for $400 million, which doesn't seem like very much to us right now, but at that time, $400 million was quite a bit more than it is right now. So he asked for $400 million to provide economic and military assistance to Greece and Turkey. Turkey was in trouble too. So that was what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine, the idea that we're going to support people that are fighting for freedom. So to try to encourage congressional support, he may have exaggerated how bad things were in Greece. It was kind of like the domino theory again, that hadn't come out yet. Truman predicted that if Greece fell, then other nations in Eastern Mediterranean and then Western Europe would fall. So he said it was important for the United States, and this was the Truman Doctrine, to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. That was the official Truman Doctrine. So basically, that would be the doctrine of the United States for the next 40 years. So Truman's view, which was followed by later presidents, was based on the idea of a domino theory, that we need to be aggressive in our containment strategy against communism. And lots of people supported it. Was publicly, that was a plus for Truman. Walter Lippmann, who was the nation's leading political journalist at that time, said that his policy was a strategic monstrosity that would eventually get the United States involved in a lot of places we didn't want to be, okay? And that forced us to be involved with dictatorships, and that turned out to be prophetically true also. In 1947, Congress also approved, Congress approved the request for economic and military assistance to Greece and to Turkey as well. All right, now let's take a look at the Marshall Plan, which is the flip side. You can kind of think of a coin and the flip side of the same coin. The Marshall Plan is the flip side of the Truman Doctrine. Just like if you think about it from a spiritual point of view, Easter is the flip side of Christmas. You know, Jesus was born for a purpose. That purpose was to die on the cross for us, be raised from the dead. You can't really have Easter without Christmas, and Christmas has no point without Easter. So same thing here, much less important, but Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan ended up being very, very important. So Marshall Plan, spring of 1947, most of Europe was in very, very bad shape. The wars had been fought there. All the countries were in terrible trouble. Infrastructure was bad. By 1947, socialist and communist parties are popping up all over the place, and European democracies are in serious trouble. So the United States was able to help. So here's another test question for you besides the essay. Test question on George C. Marshall. Sounds like a matching question, might not be. So George C. Marshall was the Secretary of State in May of 1947. If you remember, George C. Marshall had been the Chief of Staff of the United States Army during World War II. He was Eisenhower's boss during World War II. He was the guy who basically plucked Eisenhower out of the lesser-known people and made him the big commander. So by now, he's become Secretary of State. So in May 1947, he delivered a speech at Harvard University in which he outlined what our policy would be towards Europe and helping them to build up, not having to do with ideology. He just called for massive financial and technical assistance to help Europe, including the Soviet Union. It wasn't about versus communism, it was about helping the countries in Europe, including the Soviet Union, recover. That was what came to be known as the Marshall Plan. The idea was to reconstruct the European economy. If the economies in the countries were strong, that would neutralize communist insurgencies, and in a selfish point of view, would also build up foreign markets for American products. Obviously, if Europe's in bad shape, they can't buy stuff. So the Marshall Plan was part of Truman's effort to contain the expansionist tendency of the Soviet Union by basically establishing a strong Western Europe based on American values. In December 1947, Truman sent Marshall's proposal to Congress. Things helped out. On February 25th, 1948, the communists took over Czechoslovakia. That was the last nation left in the last nation left in the Eastern. Try that again. The last nation left in Eastern Europe at the time that had a democratic government, and that basically the fall of Czechoslovakia ensured Congress's agreement with the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1951, we provided $13 billion to 16 European nations under the Marshall Plan. And again, $16 billion was a whole lot more then than it is now. The official name of the Marshall Plan was actually the European Recovery Plan, and it worked. By 1951, Western Europe's industrial production was 40% above pre-World War II levels. Farm output was larger than ever. All right, that brings us to the divided Germany, which is the next thing on your slide. The Marshall Plan did bring Western Europe together, but it created problems with the Soviet Union. The breakdown of the alliance between us and the Soviets, it also left the problem of what do we do with Germany, okay? In 1945, Berlin, which was the German capital, had been divided into 4 sectors or 4 zones, each governed by one of the principal allied nations, the United States, Soviet Union, of course, France, and Great Britain. German economy was not doing very well. We were required to provide food and basic necessities to millions of civilians. In 1948, the British, French, and Americans united their 3 administrative zones into one zone and basically developed a common currency to be used in West Germany and in West Berlin. Remember, if you go back to your map thing here, Berlin is divided, but Berlin is in East Germany. So it is within the Soviet-controlled area, kind of a very strange thing there. So basically, well, I'm back to about 100 miles. Unifying West Germany and recovering itself was basically a problem for Stalin. Stalin's idea was to keep Germany weak. You know, he always felt that Germany was a big threat. So here's another test question for you, roughly speaking. So June 23rd, 1948, Stalin had the Soviet army that was occupying East Germany to stop all road and rail traffic into West Berlin. He blockaded West Berlin, hoping that if he did that, the United States and allies would decide to cut their losses and leave the city. To the Americans, this was an extremely important point in the Cold War. We had a dilemma, okay? Do we risk a third world war by trying to force the Soviet blockade to be broken, or do we tuck our tails and run and leave Berlin and West Berlin and let it become communist? Truman, of course, response was, we stay in Berlin, period. We announced an embargo against all goods that were exported from the Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany, and we started a massive airlift to supply food and other necessities to West Berliners. By October 1948, the U.S. and British Air Forces were flying in 7,000 tons of food, fuel, medicine, etc. to West Berlin every day, okay? This was what came to be known as the Berlin Airlift. It went on for 11 months. No shots were ever fired. Finally, on May 12, 1949, the Soviets lifted the blockade, partially because they'd had some very bad harvests in Russia, and they needed food that they had been used to receiving from Western Germany. To the Americans and their allies, the Berlin Airlift was the first major victory in the Cold War, and basically it essentially made the United States and Great Britain and a lot of their other allies that made us even closer. In May 1949, when the Soviet blockade was ending, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was founded. In October of 1949, the Soviets created the German Democratic Republic, what was called East Germany. All right, last thing on the slide here talks about building alliances, forming alliances. If you got lost in the book, we're on page 1009. So basically, one of the things we learned from this was it was important for us to cooperate with our allies if we wanted to control communist aggression in Western Europe. So on April 4th, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed by 12 nations. The United States, Great Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Norway, and Portugal. In 1952, Greece and Turkey joined the alliance. West Germany joined in 1955, and Spain joined in 1982. This is what was known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. NATO alliance declared that an attack against any member of NATO would be considered an attack against all. So this was a defensive alignment, not a political alignment, but a defensive alignment. It was all about basically creating a wartime pact just in case. So basically by joining NATO, this was the first time since we were allied with France in the Revolutionary War that we were committed to going to war on behalf of allies. So definitely, at least on paper, no more isolationism. There's a little cartoon for the Marshall Plan. Map on page 1611. All right, so the war is over. We have to do something with the military. Here's another test question for you. Make sure you got this in your notes. In 1947, Congress passed the National Security Act. The National Security Act did a number of things. Basically, before the National Security Act, we had a Department of the Navy, and we had a Department of War. The Department of War was essentially the Army. So this reorganized it and created a Department of Defense. Did away with the Department of Navy, Department of War, created the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense would oversee three military branches: the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. The Air Force was created by the National Security Act of 1947. Prior to that, the Air Force had operated as part of the Army. So I would say, as an Air Force guy, that would be the most important part about the National Security Act of 1947. We date our birth in the Air Force back to 1947. 47. So the three military branches, so there would be one Secretary of Defense and overall, and then there would be a Secretary for the Army, for the Navy, and the Air Force. It also created the National Security Council, the NSC. That was an advisory group trying to help the government in their working in international relations. These would be full-time experts. The act also established a Central Intelligence Agency. During World War II, we had something called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And basically the Central Intelligence Agency replaced the Office of Strategic Services, and that was intended to be a global intelligence gathering agency, nothing beyond that. All right, another thing that took place during the time, an important part of history, has to do with Israel. Not a test question, but Palestine had been a British protectorate since 1919. Palestine is essentially the biblical Holy Land. A lot of Zionists, a Zionist is a Jew who wants a separate Jewish nation, had migrated to Palestine. Of course, while when Hitler was persecuting European Jews, a lot of Jews migrated from Europe to there. And so Hitler's attempt to exterminate the Jewish race really brought attention to a lot of people that realized they needed to create their own nation. So late in 1947, the United States voted to divide, the term they used was partition, to divide Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jews agreed, but of course the Arabs did not. They already had all of it. Why would they want to give up anything? Palestine was their ancestral home too. Jerusalem was holy to the Muslims as it was to the Jews and the Christians. To the Arabs, the creation of a Jewish nation was dangerous in their idea. When that was created in 1948, they attacked it. British oversight of Palestine officially ended on May 14, 1948. The Jewish leader at that time was David Ben-Gurion, and he proclaimed Israel's independent nation. And Truman recognized the new Israeli nation within minutes. And the Soviet Union did as well, too. Early the next morning, that would be May 15th, 1948, the Arab League nations, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt invaded Israel, beginning conflict between Arab nations and Israel that obviously continues to today, on and on. Mediators from the United Nations were eventually able to come up with a truce agreement, and on May 11th, 1949, peace was restored and Israel joined the United Nations. It was a big loss for the Palestinian Arabs. Most of them became stateless refugees who would be scattered throughout neighboring nations of Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. And as you know now, that's still a big issue about the Palestinian Arabs and what they should do. All right, that brings us to basically the expansion of the New Deal. We'll hold the slide right there for a while. All right, so for the most part, Republicans and Democrats in Congress cooperated with the president on his issues on the Cold War, but on domestic issues, there was a lot of opposition. In September 1945, Truman had called Congress into a special session, and he gave them a 21-point program of his attempt to reconvert from wartime back to peacetime. Obviously, this, as we already mentioned more than one time, massive government spending during World War II had brought us out of the Great Depression and brought about full employment. But the problem now for Truman is the war is over, and a lot of those millions of men and women who had served the armed forces were ready to get civilian jobs. Some of them stayed, but most of them did not. I know my father-in-law was just finishing pilot training at the end of World War II, and they told the war was over, they could go home, and he did. He later on wasn't sure that was the best decision, but at the time, that seemed like the thing to do. That for a lot of guys, that was it. Again, some stayed, but most did not. And so now you have these millions of people looking for civilian jobs. And on top of that, you had the fact that the defense industries were fading away. Some of those defense industries could convert to peacetime industries, some cannot. So people were afraid of massive unemployment there as well, too, and they might lead to another depression. Truman called for unemployment insurance to cover more workers. He called for a higher minimum wage, and he also called for some more construction projects, New Deal types of things, construction projects to basically employ more people, and development projects that were intended to put veterans to work and a lot of stuff. Truman also asked Congress to guarantee, that's a big word, guarantee every American a job. Well, Congress, that was a little bit far. We're living right now in a time when the government's being asked to do all sorts of stuff, and it's very controversial. Congress refused to do that, but it did approve the Employment Act of 1946, which gave Truman and the government the authority to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power without guaranteeing everybody a job. So basically what was happening in 1946 is essentially Truman is trying to revive or expand the New Deal programs. You remember we've discussed before a lot of things about the New Deal Truman intended to be temporary. What the Fair Deal did was basically try to make those more permanent. So conservative Southern Democrats and Republicans, for the most part, were arguing against that. The end of the war obviously created some short-term economic problems, but nothing like the Depression that a lot of people had feared. The biggest problem that Truman faced was a spike in prices charged for consumer goods. Now, all of a sudden, consumer goods were available, not as much as people like. Labor disputes crippled some industries, particularly the coal and railroad industries. Truman actually took federal control of coal mines, and so the coal miners agreed to union demands. May 1946, Truman threatened to draft striking railroad workers into the military if they didn't go back to work. Probably not within his power to do that, but it worked and they went back to work. Truman's efforts to control inflationary prices was also creating problems for him as well, too. Everybody wasn't happy about that. All right, so if you're wondering where we are, on page 1014, okay, talking about political cooperation conflict. In 1946 would be a congressional election year, and the mantra to the Republicans is had enough, vote Republican. The war had created more powerful labor unions. Over a third of the workforce, somewhere in excess of 14 million workers, were now members of unions. Union members tend to vote Democrat. Okay, here's another test question for you. Make sure you get this in your notes. Union members tend to vote Democrat, but not in the 1946 elections because of issues going on. That gave the Republicans actually got majorities in both the House and the Senate for the first time since 1928. The Republicans controlled Congress. So they convened in early 1947, and they basically were ready to bring about their version of power. Basically, they dealt with the unions first. They passed the Taft-Hartley Act, Taft-Hartley Labor Act of 1947. That's on page 1014. It's in dark print for those looking for that. Unfortunately, I can't write things on the board for you. Basically, the Taft-Hartley Labor Act of 1947, remember, congressional acts are usually sponsored by typically one person from each party, and that's where you see the name. So Taft-Hartley, we'll see the name Taft later. So basically what that allowed employers to do was to campaign against the formation of unions and to outlaw unions from forcing workers to join. It also required union leaders to take loyalty oaths, okay, indicating that they were not part of the Communist Party. There was still a big fear of the Communist Party. It banned strikes by federal employees, and it also came up with a 80-day cooling off period on any strike that the president considered dangerous to public welfare. The biggest issue that created the most problem was one part of the bill that my grandson is sliding by, okay, unhappy. So basically, the bill allows state legislatures to pass right-to-work laws, which basically ended the practice of forcing wage workers to join a union once the majority voted to unionize. Texas is a right-to-work state. It is illegal in the state of Texas for people to be required to join a union. New Mexico, our neighbors to the west, is a union state. They have many jobs there. For example, teachers in New Mexico are required to join a union to have a job. So that's called a closed shop state. Texas is what's called an open shop state. And so that all goes back to the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. As a general rule, most states in the South are open shop states. The closed shop thing is more about the Northeast. I remember when I was an ROTC instructor in New Jersey, when we had the college graduation every year, we had that at the Garden and Arts Center, if you're familiar with New Jersey, which is a big open air pavilion. And of course, as ROTC unit, we were allowed to provide the color guard to post the flags. They were nice enough to allow us to post the flags, but we could not put the flag stands on the stage. You had to have a union card to work on the stage. And so we had to show them where we wanted the flag stands posted. I'm surprised they didn't require us to have union cards to carry the flags, but they did back down on that. So that was New Jersey. Anyway, so basically Truman from the Democratic side is supporting labor, and so he vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act. And a lot of unionists had gone over to the Republican Party, but now when Truman indicated his support, then they kind of came back. Congress, of course, overturned the president's veto, and Taft-Hartley became law. A number of strikes went down after that, and people learned to work together. All right, that brings us to civil rights in the 1940s, which is up there too. Again, it's always a mystery to how the people who write the book produce the slides, they don't match up. So civil rights, okay? All right, there is an essay choice on civil rights on the chapter 27-28 test. Basically, starting on page 1015 up through page 1018, okay? Has to do with civil rights. You need to be careful throughout the next several chapters. When I ask you a question on civil rights on a test, make sure you're answering for the appropriate time frame. I've been doing this a long time, both in high school and college, and there's always confusion about civil rights questions. Make sure you're answering it appropriate to the time frame we're talking about, because there'll be different test questions on different tests. So let's look at civil rights during the 40s, okay? Obviously, one of the big issues that Truman had to deal with was civil rights as well. A lot of the African-American soldiers who'd gone off for the country, many of them had died and had been wounded. When they got back, they expected to be treated as returning heroes like everybody else, but they faced a lot of bigotry and racism. They had fought in large numbers against the Nazis, who were racist, who were very much anti-racist. And so when the returning veterans got home, they were not going to deal with that as well. So in the fall of 1946, a number of civil rights activists went to President Truman and asked him to condemn publicly the Ku Klux Klan and the lynching of African Americans. Truman's response was to appoint a commission on civil rights to investigate what was going on. All right, here's a specific test question within the essay test question. So on July 26, 1948, Truman banned racial discrimination in the federal government. 4 days later, that'd be July 30th, he issued an executive order ending racial segregation in the armed forces. Again, the president can only be a leader for the country, but the president is in charge of the executive branch. Therefore, he can ban racial discrimination in his branch, and as commander-in-chief, he could ban racial segregation in the armed forces. So that was an important act that took place there. Took place again. That didn't take care of the country, but it took care of his area of control. Air Force and Navy quickly went along with the desegregation, but the Army was a little slow, and it wasn't until the 50s that they finally desegregated. By 1960, the armed forces were the most racially integrated of all national organizations. Truman claimed that his desegregating the military was the greatest thing that ever happened to America. All right, let's look at your slide. It's Jackie Robinson. Some of you guys are familiar with Jackie Robinson. There's actually 2 movies by Jackie Robinson. There's one actually made back in the 50s, 60s called The Jackie Robinson Story, where Jackie Robinson actually plays himself. He was a great baseball player, but not such a great actor. Okay, and then of course there's a more recent movie about Jackie Robinson. I think it was called 41. You guys would know that better than I did. So anyway, so Jackie Robinson, so he was a baseball player. Another place we saw racial segregation going away was in professional baseball. So test question for you, probably matching. In April 1947, the Brooklyn Dodgers added Jackie Robinson to their roster. He would be the first African-American to play Major League Baseball. There were, of course, what were called Negro baseball leagues much earlier in the country, going back to the days when baseball started. If you saw everybody's hero movie about the talking bat and all that stuff, they talked about there too. So he was selected partially because of his abilities, but also because of his personalities. The book says, we'll talk about what the book says and then we'll expand on that. The book says, a strong, quiet warrior, and basically had the ability to not fight back when it's provoked. Okay? And provocation took place all the time. Now, the reality is the manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers at that time was a devout Christian. And his decision to choose Jackie Robinson was based on parts of the fact that Jackie Robinson was a devout Christian. And he felt that Jackie Robinson's faith would allow him to withstand all the problems that were going to happen. And if you saw the movie, in the movie 41, there's a little allusion to the manager making a statement about being a Methodist, but it didn't really get too much into it beyond that. But the reality was, it was a specific decision made by one Christian to put another Christian into the firing line, okay, because he believed he could handle it. And he did. And again, we talked about being provoked. We're talking about not just other teams. We're talking about his own fans yelling at him. We're talking about his own fellow teams giving a hard time. Eventually, his courage, his wit, his talent would basically overcome all that. And he would get lots of fan following, and eventually racial attitudes would start to change very slowly, but they would change. Okay, the next section, here's a picture of Jackie Robinson. All right, we'll get to the election in a little bit here. We're still under the civil rights issue, so this is still under civil rights, okay? So in the far west, of course, we look at Mexican Americans, okay? Essentially, the term Hispanic or Latinos refers to all Spanish-speaking immigrants, and obviously not every immigrant comes from Mexico. We have immigrants from lots of other Spanish-speaking places too, but in our part of the world, it's mostly Mexican Americans. They had a lot of ethnic prejudice as well too. There were 500,000 Latino veterans of World War II, and they also were frustrated by their inability to be treated fairly at home. To fight those, a guy named, who was an Army major, who had been a combat surgeon, Dr. Hector Perez Garcia, organized the American GI Forum in Texas in 1948, good Texas history. So the American GI Forum was founded in Texas in 1948 to help Mexican Americans, and it soon became a national organization. They focused on veterans issues initially, but they basically eventually expanded on efforts to help equal opportunities and equal treatment for all people. That brings us heading towards the 1948. Most political analysts at the time felt that the president would not be able to get reelected in 1948. And Truman also shared that too. In fact, in July 1947, he met with General Dwight D. Eisenhower. At that time, Eisenhower was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was getting ready to retire. Truman asked Eisenhower to run as a Democratic nominee, and he even offered to be his vice presidential running mate. Eisenhower declined, saying he had another job. He was going to be president of Columbia University in New York City. So lots of people pushing for Truman. So despite the fact that things looked bad in 1948, that didn't slow Truman down. Truman campaigned strongly. In his 1948 State of the Union message, Truman announced that his programs that he would later call the Fair Deal. Fair Deal was intended to distinguish it from the New Deal of Roosevelt. And his Fair Deal that would build on the New Deal, but try to help all Americans. But his first goal was to ensure civil rights for all Americans. All right, that brings us to the election of 1948 and my unhappy grandson in the background there. All right, election 1948, test question on that as well, and a couple of test questions in there. So there's I think an essay choice on the election of 1948. So remember the Congress by now, we're in 1946, Republicans took over Congress, and so basically they're battling against Truman, and which would create problems for later. At the Republican convention, here's a test question for you. At the Republican convention, they chose a New York governor, Thomas E. Dewey, as their candidate on the third ballot. So Thomas E. Dewey, D-E-W-E-Y, was the Republican candidate in 1948. The Republicans endorsed most of the New Deal reforms, and they approved a bipartisan foreign policy. Dewey just promised he'd do a better job. Okay. In July, the Democrats met in Philadelphia for their convention. Again, some of the party leaders tried to convince Eisenhower to accept the nomination, but again, he refused. Okay. Basically, delegates figured, well, I guess we're going to have to stick with Truman, and everything's going to be quiet on the convention floor. It turned out to be not true. Okay. First off, there was a battle on the convention floor over civil rights and Truman's endorsement of civil rights for African Americans in his acceptance speech. Liberal Democrats like Minnesota's Hubert Humphrey, who was a young politician we'll hear about later, commended Truman, but white segregationists from places like Alabama, Mississippi just walked out. So the Democratic South was basically having issues over race. So on July 17th, 1948, a group of Southern Democrats met in Birmingham, Alabama, and created their own party. They nominated the governor of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond, who was a big segregationist governor, created a party called the States' Rights Democratic Party, which picked up the nickname the Dixiecrat Party. So you'll hear the term Dixiecrat later. So now we have three parties running, basically, and that makes it even look worse if you think about it. You've got a split Democratic Party, which should bode well for the Republicans, right? If you remember our history that we talked about over the past year, many times when a party splits, the other party takes over. So a few days later, on July 23rd, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party gathered in Philadelphia, and they formed a new party. So now the Democratic Party is splitting into three parties. Well, still, that really ought to look good for the Republicans. So they created a party called a Progressive Party, and they nominated Henry A. Wallace, who had been one of Roosevelt's early vice presidents and been Secretary of Agriculture, and who had been Secretary of Commerce when Truman took over and Truman had fired him. So the Progressive Party. So now we actually have four parties running in this race. We have the Republicans with Thomas E. Dewey, the governor of New York, as our candidate. We have the mainline Democratic Party, the moderates, with Harry Truman, the current president, as their candidate. We have the Dixiecrats, the radical, conservative, racist elements of the Democratic Party in the South, forming the Dixiecrats with Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina, as their candidate. And then we have the Progressives, the liberal, extremely liberal element of the Democratic Party is forming a new Progressive Party and nominating Henry A. Wallace, a former vice president, as their candidate. So you would expect then the split of the Democratic Party in three sections should basically be the death knell for Truman's campaign. But he was not a quitter, okay? And so he was renominated. So basically, he pledged to bring Congress into special session and to deal with the problems with the housing shortage and the boots minimum wage. So a couple of days later, he starts out on a 22,000-mile train campaign throughout the country, and every place he stopped, he got large crowds. So here's another test question for you within this question. The polls, obviously, as you and I would, predicted a big win for Dewey. I mean, after all, he's got one Republican Party running into 3 Democratic candidates. But here's your test question. But Election Day, Truman pulled off what was called the biggest upset in history. Basically, he garnered 24.2 million votes, almost 50% of the votes. The Dewey's 22 million, which was a little over 45%, and basically had a big-time electoral college win. The Democrats also regained both houses of Congress. The Dixiecrats, basically their rebellion had backfired and had angered a lot of black voters who turned out in massive numbers to support Truman. And the Progressive Party, being so radical, made it difficult to criticize Truman in that particular way. So big surprise. In fact, you probably have seen, there's a picture of a newspaper, I think it was like the New York Times, had already printed a big gigantic headline that said Dewey wins. There's a picture of Truman holding that picture. Obviously, the journalists do not always get it right. But in fairness, historically, the Republicans should have won. But the Democratic Party split in 3 parties, they should have won. All right, big time, interesting election, okay? All right, there's another desegregation picture there. And here's one of the Dixiecrat Party, birth of the Dixiecrats. Lots of white faces in that picture. And there's a slide of the election, 1948. All right. So basically, Truman had a surprise win, and he took that as a mandate. You hear the term mandate a lot, mandate meaning this is what people want me to do, expect me to do, to basically expand the social welfare programs. So again, he said everybody needs to expect a fair deal. Most of the fair deal proposals that gained congressional approval were basically expansions or enlargement of previous New Deal programs, higher minimum wage, expansion of Social Security to more workers, things like that. And so, but the bipartisan conservative coalition, the Republicans and the Democrats who were opposed to it, negated a lot of his ideas. Congress rejected, obviously, a number of civil rights bills. They rejected national health insurance and federal aid to education. But the fair deal didn't fail completely. It did create a basis for programs that are still around and will be around for a long time. All right, so that brings us to the Cold War heats up on page 1022. Okay. Hang in there. If you're tired, put me on pause, move on, take a break, come back. Okay. All right, so now we're into Truman's second term, and global issues are a big issue there as well too. Losing China, okay, that's on your topic there. One of the biggest things, the issue going on with the Chinese Civil War, okay. Chinese nationalists, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, had been fighting Mao Zedong and the communists since the 1920s, okay. They had basically been to a lot allied in the 30s and 40s to fight the Japanese, but after the Japanese were defeated, they could start fighting again. By the end of 1949, the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek was forced to leave mainland China and flee to the island of Formosa, which was eventually renamed as Taiwan. All right, the bomb, okay? Here's another test question for you. Make sure you got this in your notes, okay? Soviets developed atomic bomb. We learned that the Soviets had actually detonated a nuclear weapon in 1949. That frightened people all around the world and put pressure on Truman to speed up the development in our country of a hydrogen bomb, what was called the super bomb. Atomic bombs are what we used at the end of World War II. These would be called hydrogen bombs. They're much more powerful than the atomic bombs we've dropped on Japan. So now the Soviets had atomic weapons, and that made a whole new intensity level to the Cold War confrontation between us and the Soviets. And so the fear of nuclear war, nuclear annihilation, joined in with the fear of communism that would develop what was called the Red Scare. And basically the 50s, you know, I was a kid in the 50s. That was my elementary school days. And so that was a big time of people worrying about atomic war. And also it generated a lot of movies about gigantic creatures being created by atomic testing, giant tarantulas, giant ants, even giant rabbits. Okay. Lots of those popped up during the time. All right, January 1950, President Truman asked the National Security Council to look at what was happening in the Cold War and come up with some suggestions. By June, they come up with what was called NSC 68, National Security Council Report 68. NSC 68 basically endorsed Truman's containment policy that basically called for calculated and gradual coercion of Soviet expansionism. So according to NSC 68, the Soviets were trying to increase their power and increase control over the whole world. They were becoming more reckless. And NSC 68 predicted that the Soviets would invade Western Europe by 1954, because by 1954, they should have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the United States. Basically, this meant that we need to do, it suggested we impose economic controls, and it meant a big change in our normal peacetime way of doing things. So NSC 68 would become our guidebook for American policy during the Cold War. All right, that brings us to war in Korea. Okay. I had a video for you to watch in the war in Korea, but that's an actual video at school. There are some videos on, obviously, on YouTube. You can look at those, any of these you want to. I'm not going to assign one, so we'll have to kind of pass that up. But you can look up any you want to. All right, so that brings us to the war in Korea, which didn't last nearly as long as the television show MASH did. So basically, things in Europe had kind of, by the mid-1950s, things in Europe had kind of eased a little bit. Europe wasn't being invaded, but in Asia, things were getting worse. The communists had gained control, we said tonight, of mainland China by 1949, and they were threatening to destroy the nationalist Chinese on Taiwan. Japan, of course, was recovering from the devastation of bombing with our help. Douglas MacArthur had taken over in the post-war control of Japan, and eventually ended up being the consul, that is a representative of the United States in Japan. He was the one who was in charge of disarming the Japanese military, the drafting of a democratic constitution, and the economic recovery. And all those worked and made the Japanese our friends. To the east of Japan, there were issues, though, in Korea. And issues between North and South Korea were threatening to erupt into the Civil War, okay? The Japanese had controlled the Korean Peninsula in 1910. When they were defeated in 1945, they withdrew. And so by this time, the Soviets were in North Korea, and they had accepted the surrender of Japanese forces above the 38th parallel, which divides the Korean Peninsula. We had overseen the Japanese surrender south of the parallel. So the Soviets organized a communist government in the north called the Democratic People's Republic of China. I'm sorry, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea. And we established a democratic government in the south, the Republic of Korea, or South Korea, which was much more populous. By the end of 1948, we had two separate regimes occupying the Korean Peninsula, and around 2 million North Koreans had fled the north for the south. So on June 24th, 1950, at that time, the Secretary of State was Dean Acheson, and he reported on June 24th of 1950 that the North Koreans had invaded South Korea. And the Soviet equipped and backed up North Korean North Korean People's Army forced the South Korean army into a big retreat into the corner. Within 3 days, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, was captured, and things were bad. Truman assumed correctly that the attack was encouraged by the Soviets. So he decided to wage war, not as the United States, but through the backing of the United Nations. Instead of asking for Congress to declare war, he basically tried to make it a Korean effort. There's some, this is, your book really doesn't talk about this, but part of the reason some people believe that Korea may have invaded was because Dean Acheson, we already mentioned him, had made a speech about our defense perimeter in Asia. And for some reason, he mentioned a bunch of countries, but did not mention South Korea. Probably was not intentional, but that may have been taken as a sign to the communists that South Korea was open for business. All right, so here's a test question for you. So Truman goes to the United Nations, calls for an emergency meeting, United Nations Security Council in late June of 1950. The Security Council censured the North Koreans for their breach of peace. And by coincidence, you can call it coincidence, you can call it lots of things. By coincidence, the Soviet delegate was not there. If you remember, the permanent members of the UN Security Council had veto power. That was basically the allies from World War II had veto power. Well, the Soviets were not there. They were boycotting the council because the council would not allow communist China to replace nationalist China. So they were not in the meeting, and so they were not there. They might have vetoed it because it was an action against them, but they weren't there. So on June 27th, the Security Council called for members of the United Nations to furnish assistance to the Republic of Korea, whatever was necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area. Truman then ordered U.S. air, naval, and ground forces into action as UN forces and appointed 70-year-old Douglas MacArthur as Supreme Commander of the UN forces. In fact, we didn't fight. I was a comic book kid, and besides all superheroes, I also did war comics as well. And there were comics on the United Nations, and we basically didn't fight under the U.S. flag. In Korea, we fought under the United Nations flag. And so officially, that's what we're doing, and lots of other countries were involved. So he's got support from the Republicans and the Democrats, but we never were quite sure exactly why we were there or united. Korean conflict was the first military action authorized by the United Nations, and around 20 nations participated. We, of course, provide the largest contingent. We had around 330,000 troops, but there were British troops there. There obviously were Australian and New Zealand troops there, and there were troops from other Asian nations there as well. So basically, one of the things, though, the American defense did was it set up a precedent that might create problems later, that basically Constitution requires wars to be declared by Congress. Basically, what happened here was we had a way for a president to actually fight a war without the support of Congress, which would show up later. Truman basically dodged the whole issue by saying it wasn't a war, it was a police action. For the first 3 months, the fighting in Korea went bad for the Republic of Korea and the UN forces. Okay, then some movement there. All right, so then on September 15th, 1950, General MacArthur basically, we were pushed up, if you have a map of Korea, we were pushed up into the southeast corner of Korea, what's called the Pusan perimeter. And basically what we did was we went around all the communist forces, and basically did an amphibious landing behind the North Korean lines in Incheon, which is a port city near Seoul. So we made this big amphibious landing, and so we were able to divide the North Korean forces. Basically, around 25,000 soldiers from North Korea were able to flee back across the border, but we basically managed to isolate tens of thousands in South Korea, and we were able to recapture Seoul. So at this point in time, things were looking good. MacArthur, as was his leaning, became overconfident. he persuaded Truman to allow U.S. troops to actually push into North Korea. In other words, we were no longer containing, okay? MacArthur wanted to get rid of the Red Menace in North Korea, even if that meant in risking the danger of war with China. He was willing to even go into China to prevent Chinese resupply of the North Koreans. North Koreans were supported by the Chinese and the Russians. So he invaded North Korea. By October 1950, we were close to the North Korean capital, Pyongyang. On October 15th of 1950, the communist government in Beijing said that they would not stand idly by when their North Korean allies were being humiliated. So on October 20th, when UN forces entered the North Korean capital, it was followed on October 26th by units pushing towards Chosun, the Yalu River, which is a border between North Korea and China. So the night of November 25th, 300,000 Chinese volunteers, quotes the book uses, counterattacked. So all of a sudden we have 300,000 soldiers attacking us. U.S. forces are forced to retreat. By January 15th, the Communist Chinese and North Koreans had not only pushed us out of North Korea, but it recaptured Seoul. MacArthur's response was he wasn't ready for this. He asked for 34 atomic bombs. His idea was we're going to nuke China. Of course, the military leadership in the Pentagon was like, what? So at that time, Omar Bradley was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Omar Bradley was one of President Eisenhower's fighting generals during World War II in a personal aid, and he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he said it was the wrong place, wrong time, wrong war, wrong enemy. So late 1950, the UN forces were able to rally. By January 1951, we were back to Seoul, ready to counterattack, and that's when Truman started negotiating with North Korea to restore the pre-war boundary. All right, here's another important test question for you. Make sure this is in your notes. We're getting close. Hang in there. MacArthur, so Truman is trying to negotiate peace with North Korea. MacArthur, without authority from the president, issued an ultimatum for China to make peace or suffer an attack. On April 5th, Republican Minority Leader read a letter from MacArthur to Congress that criticized the president and said there is no substitute for victory, which, by the way, was one of the quotes we had to memorize at the Air Force Academy. There is no substitute for victory. Obviously, this was going outside the military chain of command. If you've been following the news lately, you saw the captain of a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier was fired for kind of going outside the chain of command. The military is very strong about the concept that you operate within the chain of command. You don't go outside. If you have complaints, you take those to your supervisor, not to somebody else. And basically, this is essentially insubordination. And so Truman, backed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, backed by all the military leaders, agreed that Truman should be fired, and he either had to do what MacArthur said or fire him. So here's another test question for you. So on April 11th, 1951, Truman removed MacArthur and replaced him with General Matthew Ridgway. So Matthew Ridgway becomes the commander of UN forces in Korea, and MacArthur is fired. The nation was divided. Obviously, he was a very popular hero. Time magazine said seldom had a more unpopular man fired a more popular one. 66% of Americans opposed Truman's decision. The fact that all the top military leaders supported Truman's decision lowered some of the criticism. The bottom line was MacArthur had violated the rules under which military people operate, and we do operate on the premise that we have a civilian control of the military, but the president makes the decision. He is the commander-in-chief. And so he had a big parade. Lots of people were happy to see him back, but the reality was what Truman did was correct. All right, so June 24th, 1951, the Soviet representative to the United Nations proposed a ceasefire along the original 38th parallel. Secretary of State Dean Acheson accepted the ceasefire with the consent of the United States. So truce talks started on July 10th, 1951 at Panmunjom, but they took 2 years, okay? And so fighting took place in that 2 years. A truce was finally reached on July 27th, 1953. There never was a peace treaty signed because there really never was an official war. But Korea, like Germany, would stay divided. Basically, the war really only restored things that were before. It cost Americans more than 33,000 deaths, along with 103,000 wounded or missing. South Korean casualties were about 2 million. The estimate was North Korean and Chinese casualties were about 3 million. Basically, we were also, Truman, there are other impacts of the war as well. We were afraid the Soviets would use the Korean War as a diversion, so Truman ordered a big expansion of U.S. military forces in Europe and around the world. Truman also increased the assistance of French troops fighting a communist independence movement in Indochina. Part of Indochina would be Vietnam. And that started our involvement in Southeast Asia. All right, we finally catch up with a slide here which says another Red Scare. We'd had a Red Scare back around 1920 or so. So the Korean War created a big one. Since 1938, the House Committee on Un-American Activities had basically been talking about communist agents within the federal government. On March 21st, 1947, Truman signed an executive order known as the Loyalty Order that required all federal government employees, government workers, to undergo a background investigation to make sure they weren't communists or had nothing to do with communists. Truman knew that this was a violation of civil liberties, but he felt he had no choice. He thought the fear about communist spies was greatly exaggerated, but you gotta do what you gotta do. All right, that brings us to Alger Hiss, okay? And there's a test question, probably a matching question on Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he had worked in a number of government agencies. Whittaker Chambers, who was a former Soviet spy, was an informer, and he told the House on Un-American Activities Committee in 1948 that Alger Hiss had given him secret documents 10 years earlier. Hiss sued for libel. Chambers came up with microfilms of State Department documents he said Hiss had passed to him. Hiss denied it again, but he was indicted, and after one mistrial was finally convicted in 1950. Here's your test question. The actual charge is perjury, okay? That was a charge, but he was convicted of lying about espionage, for which he could not be tried because, remember I said 10 years, so the statute of limitations had expired, but he was basically convicted of perjury about lying about his espionage. In 1950, the FBI came up with a spy network that involved both American and British communists. That led Klaus Fuchs, who was a German-born English nuclear physicist, to be arrested. He had worked in the United States and helped develop the atomic bomb. As it turned out, a New York couple, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were part of the same Soviet spy ring. Fuchs and the Rosenbergs were convicted, and that led charges by the Republicans that Truman's administration was not doing enough to hunt down communism. The Rosenbergs would be the first Americans to be executed for spying. That brings us on your slide to McCarthy's witch hunt. Basically, evidence of Soviet spying basically encouraged people to jump on the bandwagon. So here's your big test question for you. Early in 1950, a little-known Republican senator from Wisconsin by the name of Joseph R. McCarthy, Joe McCarthy, ended up being the biggest person to manipulate all these anti-communist feelings. McCarthy started off his witch hunt, if you will, with a speech, the Women's Republican Club in Wheeling, West Virginia, on February 9th, 1950. He charged that the State Department was full of communists. He claimed to have their names. I have a list of names here, he said, but he never provided those names. What McCarthy got was what he wanted most, was publicity. Over the next 4 years, McCarthy would make accusation after accusation, initially against Democrats, but then when he went too far, he made accusations against officers of the U.S. Army. McCarthy enjoyed the backing of a number of his fellow Republicans who were trying to hurt Democrats in the 1950 congressional elections by claiming that they weren't tough enough on communism. But by the summer 1951, McCarthyism, as it was called, was out of control. McCarthy even accused George Marshall, former Secretary of State, war hero, former commander of the army, of making common cause with Stalin by being an instrument of the communist conspiracy. McCarthy's witch hunt never did come up with a single confirmed communist agent, but he did ruin many people's lives and reputations. And basically, he really wasn't challenged until after the Korean War. The McCarran Act, there's a picture of McCarthy sweeping things out at the Capitol. So basically, fears of Soviet spies led Congress to pass the McCarran Internal Security Act in 1950. President Truman vetoed it, but they passed it over his veto and made it unlawful to combine, conspire, or agree with any other person to perform any act which would substantially contribute to the establishment of totalitarian dictatorship. So basically, by the end of the war, we were essentially committed to a permanently large national military establishment. Government agencies like the National Security Council, the National Security Agency, and the Central Intelligence Agency, which would operate and do some strange things in the 50s. The federal government, along with the presidency, got larger and more powerful and more secretive by both parties, Democrats and Republican, and created what Eisenhower would call the military-industrial complex. On March 30th, 1952, Truman announced that he would not seek another presidential term, partially because, again, he didn't figure he had a chance of winning. The war also brought higher taxes and higher prices for American consumers. A lot of people blame the president for that, obviously. Only years later would people, along with historians, really realize that Truman had dealt with a really tough time and done a really good job. By the time Truman left the White House in 1953, the Cold War was basically a way of life. It would last that way for decades. Toward the end of his presidency, the economy began to grow at what would become the fastest rate in history and transforming our society. All right, that endeth the slide here. And so the presentation, again, this is as always kind of long, but essentially, get my stop share here. Essentially, again, this is a video and you can stop it and start it however you want to. So this is chapter 27, and we will come back with chapter 28 later. So chapter 27, so you need to watch this video, get slides, get information into your notes, work on, remember, rolling along with your research papers. We really only have about 4 more weeks, a month to stuff is done, unless South Plains decides to prolong, which I doubt that's going to happen. So you need to figure time's running out and you need to roll along here. I'm not going to try to overwork you guys, but this is a college credit course and I have to meet their requirements as well. So we'll try to keep rolling here. So again, work on your papers, get your thesis statements in, anticipate a chapter 25, 26 tests the week after Easter, and chapter 28 notes coming along that week as well too. So have a good day. I'll talk to you guys come next Thursday on our visit. Bye.